The meat turned on the fourth day. By then, the sun had baked the high plains into a dustpan, and the air inside Clayton Harper's saddlebag stank like regret. He'd spent 3 days slicing and salting, hanging strips of beef over mesquite coals, thinking he had it figured. He wrapped them in cotton, tied them with wax string, and rode south thinking he'd finally get through the heat with something to chew on besides trail dust. But when he opened the sack near Eagle Pass, all he found was a wet, gray curl of rot and wasted effort. The taste of it clung to his throat longer than the stench. He threw the whole bundle into a dry wash and didn't speak for the rest of the ride. Clayton wasn't green. He'd worked cattle since he was 16, driven herds through sleet, hail, and rattlesnake country. He could lash a saddle in the dark and shoot steady with a fever, but nothing humbled him like spoiled meat. It felt like a betrayal, not just of his planning, but of the land itself. He'd followed every trick he knew: dry wind, salty rub, mesquite smoke, even wrapped it like the old-timers taught him, but the summer had won. Again. And the worst part wasn't the hunger that followed. It was knowing he'd be laughed at for thinking he could outlast the sun. He didn't tell the others. The cowboys he rode with were a hard sort, mostly quiet, mostly sharp when they weren't drunk. They brought tinned beans or hardtack or nothing at all. One of them, a half Cherokee named Reese, carried smoked venison that had lasted since spring. When Clayton asked him where he got it, Reese just pointed north and said, "Some old trapper near Crazy Woman Creek. Got tricks." And that was that. Clayton knew better than to push a man like Reese for more. But the seed had been planted. They reached the cattle buyer in Del Rio late, the herd thinner than expected and the pay thinner still. Clayton pocketed his share and spent the night eating dry biscuits and cold beans, chewing slow and staring out at the empty street. The wind carried the smell of burned grease and dried manure. Somewhere, a door creaked. He thought about that meat again, how it curled in on itself like a dead animal, how no part of it had stayed clean. He didn't even want it for food anymore. He wanted it for the knowledge. How to make something last. How to beat the heat for once, not just endure it. That night, he made a quiet promise. He'd find a way to make jerky that could last through a Texas summer and then another. And he wouldn't just make it last, he'd make it proud. He found the man in a saloon with no name, just a crooked wooden sign swinging from rusted chains. It was north of Abilene, a place where the boards creaked more than the drunks and the air stank of tobacco spit and forgotten ambition. Clayton didn't come looking for him. He came looking for shade and a drink, but he recognized the man, by the way. Others avoided his corner. Long gray hair, pulled back with twine, a hand missing 2 fingers, and a rawhide vest that looked older than the town. The barkeep called him Old Mitch and said he'd been trapping since the Comanche still ran open. Clayton bought 2 drinks and sat slow. He didn't speak for a while, just listened. The old man talked like gravel, low, slow, and dry, and Clayton caught fragments between sips. Stories of ice-thick rivers in the Big Horns, of meat hanging in pine smoke huts, of bears that sniffed but never touched. He wasn't bragging. He was remembering. Clayton waited until the saloon thinned and the old man's voice quieted to almost nothing. "What kind of smoke keeps meat through heat?" Clayton asked. Old Mitch didn't answer right away. He just looked at him, eyes foggy and wet like something behind them had never come back from winter. Then he leaned forward and tapped the table once with his knuckle. "Cold smoke," he said, "and cottonwood bark." That was all. He didn't elaborate, didn't tell him how long, or what temperature, or how to stack the logs. Clayton pressed, gently. But the old man just shook his head. "Too many folks burn it fast," he muttered. "You don't cook meat to keep it. You kiss it with smoke, slow as a funeral." The words sat heavy. Clayton let them hang. He didn't ask more, not then. That would have broken it. He thanked the old man, slid him the other drink, and sat by himself the rest of the night, turning the phrase over in his mind like a stone: cold smoke and cottonwood bark. Next morning, he left town without saying goodbye. The others were heading east toward better pasture, but Clayton turned north, toward country he barely knew. He followed the old rail cut into the hills, passed through towns that didn't last long enough to have names, and camped beneath cedar ridges where the wind whispered through old fire scars. By the second week, he was hunting wood, cottonwood. He cut a small limb and held it to flame. It smoked fast, thick and sweet, not harsh like oak or bitter like mesquite. But the real trick wasn't the smoke, it was the heat, or the lack of it. The bark burned slow, barely glowing. He watched it in the dark like it was telling secrets. Cold smoke. He started sketching designs in the dirt. Not the usual A-frame with a fire pit in the center. No. He wanted something different, something that breathed like a living thing, a house for smoke, not fire. Something that didn't roast meat, but preserved it. Something that could face a Texas summer and still keep a strip of beef good enough to eat come next spring. He didn't know it yet, but that sketch would become the start of a smokehouse that no one believed in until they tasted what it made. The first one was a failure. Not dramatic, no fire, no collapse, but a slow, creeping failure that looked almost like success. Clayton built it in a clearing near the river, far enough from the cattle dust and close enough to water. He framed it with pine beams and sided it with rough-sawn planks. Tight enough to block the wind, but loose enough, he thought, to let smoke drift through. He cut a shallow pit in the center for the fire, lined it with stone, and stacked racks high above. It looked right, smelled right, but it didn't breathe. The smoke rolled in, thick and blue, but hung low like it was drowning. By midday, the inside stung the eyes. By nightfall, the meat began to bead with sweat, not fat sweat, a sticky sheen that warned something was off. Clayton stood outside with his hands on his hips, staring at the warped tin roof, wondering where the mistake lived. The smoke had no path, it had no pull. It just sat there, choking the air, soaking into the meat like swamp water. He tried opening the door, cracking the boards, punching holes up high. It helped, but not enough. The jerky dried on the outside, but stayed damp in the middle. And worse, it tasted sour, not rotten, but off like wood left in the rain. He bit a piece, chewed, and spit it into the grass. Birds wouldn't even touch it. The whole batch, 30 pounds of beef, hung limp like dead leaves, useless. Clayton didn't curse. He didn't punch the wall. He just sat on a stump outside the smokehouse and stared at it until the sun dipped low and the mosquitoes came for him. He thought of the old trapper's words again. You don't cook meat to keep it. His fire had been too hot, too close. The smoke too thick, too wet. He hadn't built a smokehouse. He'd built a slow cooker. The problem wasn't the structure. It was the lungs. Smoke needed to rise, to move, to flow through like a river through a canyon. This was a sealed box, a prison for smoke. That night, he lay on his back beneath the stars and imagined air moving. How wind pulled through a barn crack, how scent traveled. He remembered an old barn he slept in as a boy, one that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer because of the way it was. Built vents near the roof, slats angled west, open beneath the eaves. He needed to rebuild, not everything, but the roof, the venting, the flow. The house had to inhale and exhale. Next morning, before coffee, he climbed up with a handsaw and cut the ridge vent wide open. He pried boards loose from the east wall and added slats near the bottom. Then he started again, new fire, smaller flame, cottonwood bark shaved fine and smoldered low. He hung fresh meat and sat cross-legged just outside the door, watching the smoke rise up and out like a column of prayer. It smelled sweeter, cleaner, like promise. It wasn't perfect, not yet. But something was finally breathing. He started waking before the sun, not from habit, but from hunger, the kind that has nothing to do with food. Every morning Clayton stepped into the smokehouse barefoot, quiet as a priest, and stood still in the haze. The air inside no longer bit at his throat. It moved now, soft currents rising from the pit, flowing over the meat like a whisper. He could feel it on his arms, cool beneath the warmth, like a slow breath through cotton. It was working. Not fast, but true. The wood mattered. He learned that quickly. Mesquite was too hot, oak too oily. But cottonwood bark, stripped thin and dried in the sun, smoked cool and slow, almost hesitant. It gave the jerky a sweetness, subtle, not sugary, that clung to the tongue like memory. One night he tried applewood for curiosity's sake. It was richer, heavier. The meat turned darker, tasted fine. But it didn't last. Within a week, mold crept along the edges. He burned the whole batch, and went back to bark. By mid-July, he was keeping a logbook. Not numbers, he wasn't that kind of man. Just notes. Wind direction, bark weight, smoke color. West wind strong today. Open side vent smoke too fast. Rain last night, smoke tasted sour. Let bark dry longer. Page after page of small discoveries. He didn't show it to anyone, didn't talk about it in town, but the book sat by his bedroll every night like a sacred text. It wasn't just wood and airflow, it was rhythm, timing. The meat had to be sliced just right, not thick enough to stay raw inside, not thin enough to turn brittle. He used a long curved knife from an old fur trader's trunk and carved each piece like it mattered. Hung them evenly spaced, no overlap, always east to west, so the morning sun hit them through the slats. He swept the dirt floor each day, not for cleanliness, but to track air movement. Ash drifted different depending on the breeze. He began reading the ash like sign in the sand. There were moments quiet, in the heat of the afternoon, where he swore the place spoke. A creak in the rafters, a sigh of air through the vent, the gentle sway of meat in stillness. The smokehouse had become more than a shelter. It was a body, a system, a slow machine for patience. And then came the dog, a scraggly mutt, ribs showing, tongue dry. Found it curled outside the door one morning, drawn by the scent. Clayton didn't chase it off. He fed it a strip of jerky, the newest batch. The dog took it gently, chewed slow, then lay down like it had finally found somewhere worth sleeping. It stayed. That night, he watched the smoke rise from the roof under a pale moon and realized something had changed. The meat no longer spoiled, the strips from the first week still bent, still chewed, still fed. No mold, no sour. It had only been weeks. But he knew. This jerky would last. Maybe a season, maybe longer. The secret wasn't in the fire. It was in the wind. And in the ash that told the wind story. By September, the nights turned sharp. The kind of cold that licked at your fingertips even before the sun went down. Clayton had hung the last of his summer beef a week earlier, not out of necessity, but as a test. He wanted to see what the heat would do to it one final time before the frost came. The batch dried slowly, smoked clean, and came down tough but pliable, no mold, no stench, no sign of breakdown. He packed the strips in a cloth sack lined with straw ash and left them in the corner of the smokehouse. No salt barrel, no oil, just trust. He didn't touch that jerky for nearly 2 months. Instead, he chewed through older pieces from mid-July, checking each one like a man reading scripture. Some were dry to the point of snapping, but they still tasted right. Sweet, smoky, a little gamey if he let it sit on the tongue. None had gone bad. None. Not one. Even the strips he left in the rafters, unwrapped, half exposed to the wind and dust, still edible. He told no one. The townspeople near Wood Hollow knew him as the quiet man with the dog and the smokehouse on the bluff. He came down once a week, bought flour, sometimes nails, sometimes nothing at all. The butcher offered him offcuts once, thinking the man was desperate. Clayton took them, smiled, and turned them into dark red ribbons that would last until spring. One morning in early October, a trapper named Beecham passed through, complaining of spoiled venison. He sat on the porch of the trading post, chewing bark to keep his mouth busy. Clayton handed him a strip of jerky without a word. Beecham sniffed it, turned it over, then chewed, slow, thoughtful. "Where'd you buy this?" he asked. "Didn't," Clayton said. Beecham looked at him, brow raised. "How long's it been smoked?" Clayton shrugged. 2 moons, maybe more." Beecham chewed slower. "Tastes like 2 days." He didn't press, didn't ask. Just tucked the rest in his coat and nodded. "You ever trade?" "Maybe," Clayton said. That was the first time anyone outside the smokehouse had tasted it. By mid-November, frost lined the grass each morning, and the river slowed its run. The jerky from early summer remained. The dog still chewed it happily. Clayton still wrote notes. He tried different barks. Sycamore cracked, cedar burned too hot, willow left a bitter edge. Cottonwood stayed king. He built a second smokehouse, smaller, to test fire shape, one with a sloped roof and narrower vents. It didn't work as well. The smoke lingered, the meat turned sharp. He tore it down within a week. The original, though the one that breathed right, stood solid. Smoke rose from it day and night, never thick, never hurried. Just steady, like a man with no reason to rush. Come first snow, Clayton took one of the very first strips from that sack in the corner, the one he'd packed months before, and bit off the end. It bent. It chewed soft. It tasted like the middle of summer. He sat by the fire with the dog at his feet and understood. He hadn't just made jerky that could last. He'd made a kind of memory. Winter hit hard that year. Not brutal, but constant weeks of gray sky and wind that never stopped hissing through the sage. Clayton didn't mind. He worked better when the world went quiet. With cattle penned and no drives until spring, he turned back to the smokehouse. Not to repair it, not to test new meat, but to refine it, like a man sharpening an already sharp blade. The moisture had always been the wild card. Even with perfect wood and steady smoke, winter storms could bring damp that crept in through the seams. It never spoiled the meat, but it added a sourness to the chew, a film on the surface that warned of what might come if spring brought rot. Clayton sat inside one evening as snow piled soft against the walls. He studied the roof from beneath. Smoke curled steady through the top vent, but condensation formed along the rafters. Drips landed in the dirt like slow questions. That's when he remembered something years back, a Cheyenne trader who'd used rawhide tarps inside his lean-to. Not over it inside, as lining. The next day, Clayton pulled 2 thick hides from storage buffalo, tough and still oiled, and soaked them in warm water until pliable. Then he climbed into the rafters and nailed the rawhide to the underside of the roof beams, stretching it tight across the peak like a second ceiling. When it dried, it pulled firm, tight as a drum. Beneath that, no moisture reached the racks. It worked. The smoke passed through gaps at the ridge, but the drips stopped. More than that, the temperature inside stabilized. Warmer during the coldest nights. Less brittle air. The meat dried more evenly. But it still wasn't enough. Clayton had noticed something else. The meat closest to the fire always dried different, sharper flavor, drier bend, tougher chew. The floor around the fire, after weeks of burning, had blackened with ash and bark. One night he sifted through it with a stick, fine powder, almost silky, and light as snow. He scooped it into a tin, crushed it further, and laid a layer of it across the floor of the racks, just a dusting, a fine bed for the meat to rest on. Then, on impulse, he mixed some with dry straw and packed it inside, the cloth sacks used to store finished jerky. 3 weeks later, he opened one of those sacks and caught his breath. The jerky smelled the same as the day it came down. The bark dust had absorbed every trace of moisture. The surface of the meat was dry to the touch but soft in the center, and the flavor richer somehow, deeper. He started calling it his coffin mix, not for death, but for preservation. The meat slept in it, and it woke up perfect. By March, he'd filled 4 sacks, nearly 80 pounds of jerky. Enough to last a small family through the next winter. Enough to trade, enough to test. And for the first time, Clayton didn't feel like he was gambling against the seasons. He felt like he was finally ahead of them. The bet came in May, when the earth cracked dry and the mules kicked dust just to keep sane. Clayton had come down to the outpost with a sack of jerky slung over his shoulder, mostly to trade, partly to prove something. He didn't say much when he handed out strips, just nodded and watched. Most folks chewed with suspicion first, then with surprise, then with silence. Word spread fast. By the second day, a mule train came through, headed south toward Fort Lancaster. 7 men, 18 mules, and a driver with a silver tooth and an attitude full of heat. His name was Briggs. Called himself Dust King of the Devil's Elbow. Clayton didn't care, but Briggs had a way of filling a room, loud and laughing, slapping backs and tossing coins, always watching who watched him. He tried the jerky without being asked, bit down, chewed, and raised his eyebrows. "Good smoke," he said. "Sweet edge. Bet it don't last 2 weeks in this heat." Clayton looked at him. "It's already lasted 10 months. Briggs laughed, pulled a flask from his coat, and set it on the table. "You saying that meat rode through last summer?" Clayton nodded. Briggs grinned. "Tell you what, I take a strip with me. If it's still good when we hit Fort Lancaster, I leave this behind." He tapped the flask silver, hand-stamped, full. "If it ain't, I keep the meat and the bragging rights." Clayton didn't answer right away. He unwrapped a fresh strip, the oldest in the bag, and handed it over. "Don't open it till you get there." Briggs took it, weighed it in his palm like it meant something. "Deal." They shook on it. No witnesses. Didn't need them. 2 weeks passed. Clayton stayed up in the hills, repairing a broken rack beam, testing a new fire pit made of flat stones to even out the burn. He didn't think much about the bet. He didn't have to. He knew what was in the bag, knew what the bark dust had done, knew what kind of silence the smokehouse held every time he stepped inside. But on the 15th day, he rode into town and found the flask waiting for him on the step of the trading post. No note, no word. Just the flask, full and cool to the touch, with a piece of cottonwood bark tied to the top. Briggs never said a thing, but folks remembered. After that, Cowboy started asking questions. Could they see the smokehouse? Could they buy some jerky? Could he show them how it was done? Clayton gave nothing away. Not yet. He'd earned his quiet the hard way through summers of spoiled meat and winters of small experiments. Let them wonder. Let the flask do the talking. Because that jerky hadn't just survived a mule train. It had survived time. By mid-June, the jerky had legs. It started with a cattleman from El Paso who rode 3 days just to taste what he'd heard about from a railroad cook near San Angelo. Then came a deputy marshal from Santa Fe who claimed a piece of Clayton's meat had made it all the way through Arizona territory without turning. It became a kind of legend whispers in saloons and around fire pits. A strip of beef that didn't rot. A cowboy's ration that held strong from one summer to the next. No one believed it, not really. But enough men had chewed it to keep the stories alive. Clayton didn't advertise. He didn't build a stand or sell by the pound. He just kept the fire low, the bark dry, and the smokehouse breathing. If you came to him with something worth trading good leather, fresh horseshoes, a barrel of unspoiled salt, he might hand you a small sack. Maybe 2. If he liked your questions, he might even answer 1. But most came with money. And money meant nothing. It wasn't pride. It was principle. Jerky that could last through 2 states of dust, a thunderstorm, and a broken canteen wasn't made for profit. It was made for survival. It was the difference between a man finishing his ride or folding in a ditch. And Clayton knew that because he'd been that man, chewing bitter leather when meat turned soft in his pack. By August, his jerky had crossed 6 state lines. Cowboys brought it into the Sierra Madre, trappers into the Rockies. One woman, an Army Scout's widow, took a full bundle with her on the mail coach to Kansas. Wrote Clayton a letter a month later saying she'd buried half of it in a root cellar and came back after 3 weeks to find it cleaner than the preacher's cloth. The smokehouse never grew. Same walls, same roof, same hand-cut vents that lined up with the wind like they were born that way. The hide tarp beneath the rafters still caught the drips. The floor still held bark, dust mixed with straw ash, and a pinch of salt. The racks polished now from oil and time still held meat, like pews held sinners. Clayton had learned one more trick. He started layering the jerky in cotton cloth soaked lightly in sage tea, then dried under the sun. The scent was faint, but it seemed to keep flies off longer, and somehow the flavor turned richer. Like memory smoked into every fiber. He didn't write that one down. Some things weren't for paper. One evening, a group of young wranglers from New Mexico rode in with dust in their teeth and doubt in their eyes. They wanted to buy 12 pounds for a long cattle push east. Clayton gave them 6, told them to come back when they'd seen for themselves. 2 months later, they returned thinner, wiser, and quiet. They didn't ask for more. They just shook his hand. Because the meat had lasted, through heat, flood, dry wind, and broken saddles, it had held. And they had, too. The first man who tried to copy Clayton's method was a neighbor named Silas Rourke, big talker, bragged he could build anything better, faster, cleaner. He came by one afternoon with a notebook and a friendly smile, pretending to trade salt for jerky, but his eyes kept scanning the smokehouse, measuring angles, counting slats, peering into the rafters like secrets would fall out. Clayton didn't stop him. He'd seen that look before, ambition without patience. 2 weeks later, smoke rose over the ridge. Not the sweet curl of cottonwood, but the black, bitter smoke of a fire that got out of hand. Silas had tried to cottonwoods, burn mesquite low and slow. Hadn't understood the trick. The fire caught in the thatch roof. His shed, tack room, and a month's worth of meat went with it. No one was hurt. But the lesson stung harder than flame. Others followed. One man used green pine, molded in 3 days. Another tried to line his racks with rawhide, attracted every fly in the county. A tanner from San Marcos built a smokehouse with brass vents and a sealed roof, claimed science would do what instinct couldn't. His jerky turned sour before August. They all came back, eventually, not to beg, but to ask, "What's the fire temp? How thick's the bark dust? How long does it hang before bagging?" Clayton answered the way the wind answers a canyon, quiet, indirect, and not always in words. He told them to sit by the smokehouse and listen. Told them to hang one piece and taste it each day. Told them to chew slow. They wanted numbers. He gave them rhythm. That's what made his method impossible. To steal. It wasn't a recipe. It was a conversation with wind, heat, wood, and time. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't fake it. You had to live inside it, day after day, storm after storm, failure after failure. Most didn't have the stomach for that. They wanted the end without the means. Still, the whispers grew. Some accused him of using chemicals. Others said he was hiding some French trick or stealing knowledge from the tribes. A few said he was just lucky. That maybe the meat wasn't even that good, just well-timed. Clayton never responded. He didn't need to, because the jerky spoke for itself. One day, a man rode in from Waco carrying a tin box wrapped in canvas. Inside was jerky so tough it snapped like twigs. He wanted to trade it, claimed it came from a high-grade smokery down south. Clayton bit a piece, chewed, and spit it into the dirt. "Too fast," he said. The man left red-faced. That night, as the smokehouse glowed soft under the stars, a breeze carried the faint scent of fresh bark curling on low flame. The dog stretched at his feet. A new rack of beef hung slow, sagging gently as the smoke curled past. Outside, men guessed. Inside, the fire whispered truth. You couldn't copy patience. He was old by the time he hung the last one. The dog was gone, the pages in his notebook faded, and his knees no longer liked the ladder. But the smokehouse still stood leaning a little, maybe, but breathing just like it had when it was new. Clayton tied the strip by hand. Just one. A wide piece of beef, sliced clean, rubbed with nothing but time. He hung it on the top rack, just under the ridge vent, and walked out without looking back. He told no one. Seasons passed. The smokehouse went quiet, only lit on cold days when a younger cousin used it for small batches. But that last strip remained untouched. It hung there through summer storms, dry winters, and a windstorm that knocked the outhouse clear off its base. No one disturbed it. It became legend among the few who knew. Old Man Harper's last piece, like it held something sacred. On his 70th birthday, Clayton returned. He moved slower now. A cane, a limp. But his eyes still saw the air, still followed the way the wind moved through the rafters. He stepped inside and breathed deep. The bark dust had hardened into a kind of clay. The hide-lined ceiling still held tight. And the last strip, dark, twisted, but whole, swayed gently in the cross breeze like it had been waiting. He didn't take it down. Instead, he brought a chair, lit a fire, and sat with it. A boy came by that evening, 13, maybe 14. Said his father had once traded for jerky that fed them through a cattle drive in a dust storm. Said he wanted to learn, not for money, not for glory, just because the world didn't taste the same anymore. Clayton didn't speak much, just pointed to the fire, the vents, the cottonwood bark stacked neat against the wall. The boy listened, watched, then noticed the strip hanging in the corner. "That still good?" he asked. Clayton smiled. Only one way to know. He stood slow, cut the strip, and handed the boy the end. The boy chewed, slow at first, then eyes wide. It was dry, yes, tough. But the flavor rolled out steady smoke, bark, wind, time. It tasted like a memory older than him. Like something passed down through hands, not words. "It's perfect," the boy said. "No," Clayton whispered, "it's right." That was the last batch. The smokehouse remained. Locals cared for it, patched its roof, swept its floor. Travelers came to see the place where meat beat the sun. But no one ever made it the same way again. Not quite. Because the secret wasn't just the fire or the wood or the dust. It was him, his rhythm, his silence, his stubborn refusal to settle for anything that wouldn't last. The jerky wasn't a recipe, it was a life. And for 2 summers straight, and every season after it, stayed good.